Good evening. You know, growing up, for some reason, David and Goliath was always my favorite Bible story. Absolutely loved it. And I'm sure it had nothing to do with the fact that I like to pretend like I was King David. But as I got older, as I considered what that account was actually about, just as we studied with the book of Jonah and how Jonah is not really a children's story, we use it to teach children valuable lessons. But when you really study Jonah and you look at the horrific, idea of someone being swallowed alive by a great fish, David and Goliath is not a story for the meek of heart. David and Goliath is not a children's story. It's a story that was written for us. It was recorded. It was a historical event that took place that God wanted us to know, wanted us to see, wanted us to learn from. And we, like so many other things, have regulated it to a children's story. And when we talk about David and Goliath, we go, oh, well, that's just something we learned as kids. Now, other accounts of David, sure, we talk about them. We have no problem talking about David and Bathsheba or David and the numbering of the Israelites. But when it comes to David and Goliath, well, that's just a children's story. But when we really think about it, in 1 Samuel 17, verse 51, God records, therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine. He took his sword, he drew it out of his sheath, and he killed him. He cut off his head with it. If I walked into the living room and my children were watching a TV show where someone was standing over someone with a sword and they cut their head off, I would turn that show off. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you say, you're too young to watch that? This just highlights the reality that these stories are meant for us. We can learn from them. We can use them to teach our children, but they are meant for us. They're meant for us to learn from. They deal with matters that are very important for adults. When we really look at the accounts of David and Goliath, what we find is what it happens when one individual or one nation or one group or one law or one whatever, however you want to view it, when something persecutes and defies God, there is a response from his children. They will either cower in fear or they will stand firm. That is the message of David and Goliath. When we are tested, we will respond in one of two ways. And that's exactly what we see. We see Goliath's defiance. Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. We'll start in verses 1 through 3. In 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 3, we start reading, Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Fouke, which belongs to Judah. They camped between Fouke and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and they drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. They're ready to do war. You have opposing forces on both sides. This is an epic battle that's about to take place. Until a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze armor on his legs and a bronze helmet javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. We are not 100% sure how tall Goliath was. We can give a really good estimate. It's more than likely he was over 9 feet tall. The reason we can give that estimate is we have about what a cubit's supposed to be. But over time, that has changed. So there is some discrepancy into just how tall Goliath was. But he was a giant of a man. He was a giant of a man, trained from war from his youth. He was a man who stood in armor that would make your average person fall beneath the weight. He wielded a spear that your average man could not have even picked up. He had a shield bearer go before him. The shield bearer's purpose was to basically cry out, "Behold, look at our champion." He was of such importance to the Philistines that they gave him his own shield bearer, basically someone to cry out, "Hear ye, here's our champion." Goliath was a champion of war. He is a man who knew war, knew how to kill someone, was more than adequate at killing someone, and he stands before the entire army of the Israelites, and he's going to laugh. Verse 10 says, "And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." 101 combat's all he asked for. Now, this was a common practice. We see it in ancient battles. A champion would go out and say, "Look, you versus me. I'm the best there is in our army. You find someone to challenge me. If you win, we surrender. If we win, you surrender." It was a common practice. Now, it never really went that way. But the general idea was that if you defeated the champion, the opposing army would be so demoralized, so overcome, that they would break and fall away, which is exactly what happens to the Philistines with the death of Goliath. They are so overcome with shock that when Goliath dies, they break, they run, they flee, and the Israelites are able to overtake them. But Goliath stands before all the Israelites, and he says, "I defy the armies of God." See, I changed the word there a little bit. He says, "I defy the armies of Israel," but the reality is he says, "I defy the armies of God," because I defy God. Because that is who this Philistine is spitting in the face of. That is who he is truly opposing, is God, the God of Israel. In fact, when David goes before him, we see he is still defiant. In fact, he's angered that they would dare send David. In verse 43 through 44, Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the fields." He says, "This is your champion? Do you truly ridicule me so much? I defy the armies of Israel. I defy God. You are nothing to me. You are nothing to this great champion of the Philistines." Now, let's be fair. Here is a man trained from youth for war. Here's a man who is massive, who is powerful, who is so confident that he is willing to stand before the entire army and say, "You bring anyone, I've got it." When you really consider who Goliath is, what he is, and the reality that he is bold enough to go before the entire army, you can understand why someone might hesitate. But the reality is, what we find is Saul's failure in this instant. Now, the first verse we're going to read, in verse 11, still 1 Samuel 17. But in verse 11, we go back a little bit, and it says, "When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and were greatly afraid." You go, "David, how are you saying that this is Saul's failure?" He says all of Israel was greatly afraid. All of them were dismayed. when the leader of Israel failed to stand firm in his faith of God, it set a precedent for the entire people. Men, when we fail to lead our families, we are setting a precedent for our entire family. When we fail to show our community what it means to be a Christian, we are setting a precedent for the entire community. When as a nation we fail to stand up for God, we are setting a precedent for the entire nation. It goes on and on. You see how it works. Saul was the king. He was selected by God to be the king. He was chosen to lead God's people, and yet his failure to rally the Israelites and say, we have God, is what leads to everything that follows. And it is a lesson for us that when we are in positions of leadership, we must place our trust in God. Yes, Israel fell. The whole army of Israel cowered before a Philistine. But the ultimate lesson to learn here is that Saul failed his responsibility as king. And this is a great parallel between the kingship of Saul and the kingship of David that was to come. Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. It's interesting, when we stumble, when we make mistakes, when we fall, oftentimes there is an opportunity to correct it. There is a chance to fix our mistake. And that chance for Saul came in verse 33. A little bit before this, you see David, he goes, and we're going to talk about David in a minute, but David, he goes and says, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the individual that kills this giant? And they take him to Saul. And Saul looks at David in verse 33, says, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. David's approach to Saul should have been a wake-up call. It should have been, hey, I'm supposed to be the one that is courageous, that trusts in God, that will go before the Israelites and say, we can do this, not this young man. And a side point, a youth in ancient Israel could be up to 30 years old. David was not a child at these tellings. While we don't know exactly how old he is, it makes no sense historically or biblically or contextually for him to have been a child. He is a young man. When David goes to Saul and says, I'll do it, it should have been his wake-up call, but instead he goes, well, look, you can't do this. Look at him. You can't fight. How often do the people who are supposed to be building us up tear us down instead? How often do when you present something that says, we can do this, we can make change, we can grow, we can be better, we can improve, there's always someone there who says, well, no, we can't do that. We can't work at it. It's just bound to fail before we ever start. Saul should have lifted up the Israelites, and instead, Saul tore David down. Saul failed yet again. Verse 38 through 39. So Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. You know, really, this goes more with David. It's a true showing of David's faith, but I want to point out one thing about it. Saul had the armor. He had the armor of a king. You know, in the book of Samuel, in the beginning, when Samuel is so disgusted with the Israelites because they want a king, and he tells God, and this is what they're wanting, and God says, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me, that I should not be king over them. God tells Samuel, here's what your king's going to do. He's going to make your children go off to war. He's going to tax you. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. Where do you think this armor came from? It came from the taxes of the people in which Saul was supposed to protect, and yet he puts them on a young man. And he goes, well, if you're going to fight my battles for me, you go ahead. And it took David to say, this isn't for me. I will fight God. I will fight Goliath with what God has promised and blessed me with. You see, David's faith is a stark contrast to the failure of Saul. Saul says, we cannot do it. David says, why are you not doing it? And that's really the key difference there. David starts off his questioning with, well, why are we not doing this? Here is a man who is defying our God. Why are we standing for it? Why are we standing for someone to insult our God? That was not the right verse. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 through 47, David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. You have defied the God of the armies of Israel. You come to me with all this weaponry. You come to me as a giant, capable, a man of war. Saul told him that. I come to you in the name of God. He continues, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all of the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword or the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. Do you remember earlier when we looked at what Goliath said to David? He said, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And then he looks, verse 33, I believe, he looks at David and he says, I'm going to give your body to the fowls of the air. David counters with saying, I am with God. I will give the host of the Philistines. He says, you threaten me? My God is so great, my God is so powerful, that it will not be you. I will take your head, but then I will give the whole host to the fowl of the earth. Do you see the clear distinction? Goliath says, I'll kill you. David says, by the power of God, I will conquer this entire army. Because that is how great my God is. Verse 48, so it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried. He hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. You get the idea of Goliath just standing up and start walking towards him, and David's like, no, we're going to do this, and he starts running. He runs to meet him. Saul ran away, David ran towards him. Why? Because Goliath defied God. Verse 51, as we read in the beginning, David has taken his sling. He took one of those stones, and there's so much more we could talk about in this context. You know, Goliath had 4 brothers. David took 5 stones. David took the weapon of a shepherd. He took a sling. he took his staff. He wound that sling up. He shot that rock. It hit Goliath between the eyes. And then David, with his courage, ran up to the giant, took the sword that would have been massive for him to hold, and used it to cut off Goliath's head before anything else could happen. He wasn't wearing armor. He wasn't trained for war. In fact, he tells Saul previously, his experience with battle was fighting a lion and a bear who came to take what belonged to his father. And now he stands before a giant, armed with the same equipment, to stop another monster that's come to take what belonged to his heavenly Father instead. This is not a children's story. It is a story designed to tell us when we are faced with those who would defy our God, we have two choices. We can fail, we can shirk our responsibility, we can deny our ability, or we can be like David and we can have faith that God will provide. We can stand firm, we can stand tall, we can accept the challenge that's thrown in the face of our God, knowing that He is our God. I love the story of David and Goliath growing up. And oftentimes it's taught as, the little man winning. My brothers and sisters, there's so much more to this story. Let us never forget that we are going to face people who deny God, people who defy God, people who denounce God. And it is our responsibility to stand up and tell them no. Our God is the great Almighty. This evening, if you were here, and you realize that somewhere along the way, somewhere as you have lived your life, you have taken on the mentality of Saul. We just can't do it. Turn back from that mentality. Look at the example of David and realize that with God we can do all things. We can overcome the persecutions. We can overcome the defiance of those who stand against us. We can endure. If you were here this evening and need the prayers of the congregation, if we can help you in any way, now's the time as we stand and as we sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing cup? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully